You're listening to the Common Descent Podcast. But we digress. Hello, Will.
Hello, David.
Hello, listeners, and welcome to a very special digression of the Common Descent Podcast.
Yeah, this is going to be an interesting one.
Now for something completely different. Episode 12 was all about the geologic timescale, and we talked a lot about where the timescale comes from and how we determine where things fit on the timescale. But something that we didn't, we touched on was this notion of just how deep is deep time.
Yes.
What is the scale of the geologic timescale?
Because it's really hard to picture that just by talking about it.
Yes, and it's, as we mentioned in that episode, we know a lot about more recent things, so it's hard to imagine where exactly things fit in relation to each other. It's easy to get this misconception that things happened at the same time that didn't happen at the same time. It's hard to get your mind around it. There are a lot of examples that various geology educators have attempted to use to demonstrate the scale of the timescale.
Mm-hmm.
Probably the most popular one is the calendar.
Yeah, that's the one you see most often.
The beginning of the Earth is at midnight on January 1st, and the whole Earth history fits into 1 year. This is when animal life appears in, September or whatever, and the dinosaurs show up on December something.
Yeah.
I've also seen it done with steps, where it's distance. So, if every step you take is 10,000 years, how many steps does it take to go back to, Archaeopteryx, and how many steps to the Cambrian explosion and things like that. So there's a lot of different ways to attempt to visualize.
Yeah, to try to convert it to something understandable.
Indeed. What we thought would be fun would be to do this as a podcast.
Yeah.
So we present to you, the listeners, the podcast timescale of Earth. Over the majority of this digression episode, which is a much longer one than usual, we are going to follow the history of the planet from start to finish at approximately 31.5 trillion times normal speed.
Yeah, just notching it up a little bit.
Just a little faster than usual. We are going to follow the timescale under the conversion that every second equals 1 million years. This will make the 4.5 billion year history of the planet Earth condense into about an hour and 15 minutes.
Yep.
But we're going to keep everything to scale. We're a straight conversion. To put that into perspective a little bit, all of recorded human history takes place in about the last 10,000 years, which is an amount of time we will breeze by 100 times a second. The entire history of our species will happen within less than the last half second of this podcast timescale.
Yep.
So we're not going to talk about humans very much.
No.
We're going to be talking about all the other stuff.
Yeah, we'll wrap it up pretty quickly.
Oh yeah, you won't even notice when the humans come in. But we will start at the beginning. So the way that we are going to do this is Will and I are going to start our timers. Starting from 0, we will take you on a journey from the beginning of the planet Earth to the present day and point out various events as they happen as we pass them on our super speed trip through time.
Everyone, please buckle your seatbelts at the time. Keep all arms and legs inside whatever you're sitting on.
Yes, inside the podcast at all times.
Yes.
Please do not stand until time has come to a complete stop.
Exits are here, and anywhere.
Hang on to your turban, kid. All right. Are you ready, Will?
I am indeed.
Are you ready, listeners? Good.
Yes. All right.
We are going to start at the beginning of the world. Our 4.54 billion year history of the planet starts in 3, 2, 1, start. We are right here starting at the formation of the Earth shortly after the beginning of the solar system in the first section of our timescale called the Hadean Eon. This is a time period where the crust is still forming, oceans and atmosphere haven't quite come together yet,
Mm-hmm.
lots of extraterrestrial bombardment, very little rocks and minerals, no fossils whatsoever are preserved from this time period. We know very, very little about it.
Yeah, this is when we're becoming a planet,
Yes.
which is pretty crazy. This is the stuff that people don't typically talk about, but this is when we're, like you said, we're getting hit by a lot of, you know, space debris,
Mm-hmm.
and things are starting to form and slow down as the solar system is taking its shape.
Yes, this is. I mentioned that there's no fossils from this time period that we're in right now, the Hadean, named after Hades, aptly.
Yeah, very, very fitting.
Yup. There are no fossils known from here, and there was probably little to no life at all
Yeah.
because it would have conditions suitable to live in would have been very few and far between.
Yeah. For me, this is a really interesting time because this is when we get our moon.
Yes, the moon forms probably right about now where we're
Yeah.
talking in our timeline.
And it's interesting because people don't typically think about that, but we did not start with a moon. And as best as scientists understand it, we were hit by a Mars-sized object that
Yes.
knocked a big chunk of us off, which then decided to hang around and become our moon.
Yup.
Which is pretty crazy. Like, this was a time when the solar system was crazy. I mean, it was happening on a very long time scale, but it was crazy what was going on. Things were slamming into planets, were colliding.
Oh yeah, everything is still forming right out
Mm-hmm.
of the solar nebula of space dust.
Yeah, which is pretty awesome.
Now, the age of the Earth is determined by mostly by comparison with other celestial objects that we've dated. Right about now, in our timeline, around 4.4 billion years ago, is when we see the oldest known minerals.
Mm-hmm.
These are zircon grains from Australia. They date back, like I said, to 4.4 billion years. They are the oldest dated Earth material that has ever been discovered.
So we're starting to get things cool enough that they can actually form into recognizable shapes, where minerals are
Yes.
starting to form and things like that.
There's a lot of discussion that goes on during this time period about when exactly did we start having a definite ocean,
Mm-hmm.
when exact steps in the atmosphere formation.
Yeah.
Did we have was the floor lava,
Yeah.
or how much crust was there? And these are things that are really, really difficult to know,
Yes.
largely because we have just about no evidence from this time period.
Yeah. And it's, until we get to watch a planet form somewhere else, we've never
Yep.
gotten to see. All the planets were already here by the time we started looking at them.
So when people ask, it's a common question to ask, if we could travel back in time, could we survive on the planet? And the answer for a lot of Earth history is no,
Mm-hmm.
but the answer for this time period is a very definite no.
Yeah, right.
It's not even certain you would have a place to stand.
Yes, exactly. Like this is as uninhabitable as any of the other planets in our solar system are right now. Like,
Yeah.
it is not yet it's still cooking. Like, that's the best way to think about
Yeah,
it. Is
it's
our
not done
planet
yet.
is not done yet. Is still cooking. Which is super interesting. I mean, I don't know. This is we often talk about, Earth and its history, but we don't always talk about why it's unique and how it formed. The fact that I'm sure many of our listeners have heard of the Goldilocks zone before.
Mm-hmm.
But that our planet is the right distance from the sun to have liquid water.
Yep.
And little things like that, the fact that we have a moon and other large planets and asteroid belts in our solar system that help protect us from impacts.
Yep.
The fact that we have the right setup has protected our little ball so that things could grow on it.
Yeah, and I've even heard people make the argument that we're the only planet in the solar system that has currently active plate tectonics.
Yes.
And that might be necessary
Mm-hmm.
for the kind of life that we have.
Yeah,
and that we, our type of atmosphere is very particular. And even, the magnetic field of the Earth might be
absolutely.
part
Well,
of this.
there's lots of evidence, because from everything we've seen, Mars was very likely a lot like Earth at one point.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, it is also in the habitable zone, the Goldilocks zone. It's
Oh,
on
yeah.
the outer edge, but it is. But it does not have that electromagnetic field, which means we see evidence for liquid water, that there was once liquid water on Mars and a number of other things. But if they lost that electromagnetic field, there would be no way for the planet to hold its atmosphere, which is what
Right.
keeps the temperatures correct for things like liquid water.
Yeah. So there's this interesting combination with Earth. It's easy to say, oh, Earth has all the perfect ingredients
Mm-hmm.
for life, which, as we'll see as we go through this podcast episode, is not really the case.
Yeah.
It's a combination of Earth having good conditions
Mm-hmm.
and then also life terraforming.
Yes.
Which we will see a lot of, right? The atmosphere we have today is only the way it is today because there's life on the planet.
Yeah. It's that, and which is a very interesting concept. You don't typically think about it that way. It almost always is going the other way, where the actual, habitat and current situation of the Earth is affecting the life. It's very rare that you typically think about it going the other way around, and usually you only hear about it with humans.
Yes.
And it's cool to think that that's been happening for a while.
Indeed. And you mentioned this being a time of intense collision
Mm-hmm.
and such. And there was, during this period that we're in right now in our time scale, a time period of some duration known as the Late Heavy Bombardment, which is a time where it's thought that the Earth was basically getting hit all the time
Yeah.
with extraterrestrial rocks flying through space before the solar system kind of stabilized enough that there wasn't so much debris flying around.
Mm-hmm. And it's really interesting because people don't typically think about it, but there's a question to be asked as to why are we not crater pocked like the moon is, and it's because of how we formed and where we are in the solar system.
Yeah. Well, the reason that we don't hold on to our craters is that we have an active surface.
Yep. And so they get eroded away and moved around
and subducted and uplifted and all sorts of stuff. And that's another thing that, the surface of most, the surface of the moon, the surface of Mars, the surface of most asteroids and Pluto, are what has been the surface for quite some time.
Yeah.
Whereas on the Earth, most of the surface of the Earth is very young comparatively.
Yeah, we are a living planet not because we have life, but because our planet is actually still moving on the inside and outside.
Yes, it's an active planet.
Yeah, which is cool to think about. The others have, gone dormant isn't quite the right, but they've stopped that process.
Yeah, they don't have that activity. Right now, we have hit the 4 billion years ago mark.
Woo!
We are not quite 10 minutes into the podcast episode, into our timeline, that is. 4 billion years ago is also around the time that we see the oldest rocks. So the oldest minerals that we mentioned before are just that, minerals. They're grains of zircon, microscopic, tiny little grains. I think they're on display in either the museum in New York or in the Smithsonian. One of them has, I think, some of these.
I know we saw them, but I can't remember which one it was in.
Yep. But these are the oldest rocks, and some of the oldest rocks on the planet come from the Acadian gneiss up in Canada. These are rocks that seem to be around 4 billion years old, which puts them during this time that we are still in, by the way, in our time scale, of, dynamic formation, which of course does indicate that we're starting to get solid crust
Yeah,
formation.
things are cooling or settling enough that rocks are able to solidify.
And
And
then
so
stay that way.
and stay that way. So we're things are slowly but surely stabilizing.
And those solidifying chunks of this continental rock will ultimately end up forming the basis for the continents.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Most continents that we have today are built around these cratons, these ancient solid cores
Yeah.
that the continent has sort of built up around.
Mm-hmm.
And this is going to be around the time that we're getting those forming.
And which is another thing that's crazy to think about. It's 4 billion years is hard to wrap one's mind around. It's even crazier to think that things that happened then are still at the core of things today. Like
Yeah.
these are rocks that have been around for 4 billion years. That's crazy.
Well, that's one of the reasons that I love going through the time scale is that it's just so cool to see how things come together.
Mm-hmm.
It's like when you're watching it's like watching a Quentin Tarantino film
Yes,
where he
exactly.
shows you the end and then you know what the end looks like and then
Mm-hmm.
you go through the whole process and watch as the familiar things come together.
Yeah, as you start to recognize the pieces. Yeah, going through
Yup.
the geologic time scale is very much like watching Memento. For anyone out there who's seen,
Yes.
where you just keep discovering new pieces. Like, wait, I know this has to be before that and after that,
Yup.
and then you find out who's the crazy one.
Turns out it's Christopher Nolan. Indeed.
It's awesome.
So the Hadean Eon,
Mm-hmm.
this time period that we've been in, this hellish time period, is about to end. Here at around 3.8 billion years, right about now, the Hadean Eon is over, and we have transitioned into the second of our big divisions, the Archean Eon.
R.I.P. Hadean.
R.I.P. Hadean. The Archean Eon is going to be very interesting because now we're in a time period where we have stable crust to form, like we said, the formation of continents. There are now oceans, proper, consistent oceans. We have an atmosphere in the Archean, although it is not an atmosphere like we have today.
Yeah.
There is very, very little oxygen in this atmosphere, lots of methane, lots of ammonia,
Ugh.
things like that, once again, not a great time for somebody like us to be around and try to live there.
It's not very good for lungs.
No, it's not. Fortunately, there were no lungs at this time.
Ha.
But around this time, where we are right now, transitioning into the Archean, this is around the time that we start getting reports of the possible earliest signs of life. At this age, way back here, more than 3.5 billion years ago, we're not finding fossils.
Mm-hmm.
We're finding chemical traces
Yeah.
in the rock that are the kinds of things that are caused by living organisms interacting with the environment.
Yeah.
Most of the evidence from this far back is contentious. Maybe it's life, maybe it's something else, but there's hints that life had already gotten started by the beginning of the Archean.
Yeah, it's a lot of these kind of evidences are one of those things where it would make sense if there were life, but
Yep.
by no means does that mean it was definitely, and definitively the beginnings of life.
Now, it's interesting to think about that because if those signs are indeed evidence of life, right, from as far back as 3.8 billion years, and one of the rules of the fossil record is the first in the fossil record is almost never the actual first.
Mm-hmm.
Because the fossil record is incomplete, right? You're getting
Yes.
the 10th or the 12th or whatever. So if life was around back then there's a good chance life kicked off around the end of the Hadean.
Mm-hmm.
And if we're right about the Hadean, that would mean that life kicked off about as soon as life could have kicked off. Which is really intriguing.
He was just waiting in the wings, ready to go.
Just waiting to go.
It's really interesting because this has been something in not like super recent, but in just generally more recent times of scientific discovery. But the common thought with life was that it was a very delicate thing that needed very precise settings to be able
Mm-hmm.
to survive. And then as we've explored more and more, we've realized no, life will live just about anywhere you put it. We have extremophile bacteria in highly corrosive pools, and
Yep.
poison things that would be poisonous to us. We have the underwater sea vents, entire
Oh yeah.
ecosystems functioning without sunlight.
Super heated, super toxic. Some
Mm-hmm.
places super cold, like cold seeps, very
Yeah,
cold
they've
waters.
found life underneath the Arctic ice sheets that have,
Yep.
as far as they can tell, not been exposed to the outside world for crazy amounts of time. And so it is, though it seems crazy, not as surprising that life may have, as soon as things set up, that the right scenario came up for life to begin, and it did.
Yeah. And indeed, we mentioned most life today would not be able to survive at this
Mm-hmm.
time period that we're in on our time scale. And that's why when scientists are investigating what may the earliest life have been like, they look toward to those extremophiles.
Exactly. When times were more
Places
extreme.
like hydrothermal vents and acidic pools and things like that. The kinds of, places without a lot of oxygen,
Mm-hmm.
places with a lot of ammonia, things like that.
It may have seemed something very similar to that, which is interesting. The beginnings of life are still one of the most debated and discussed topics because it is still very much a mystery.
Yeah. It's one of those, it's an interesting subject because, and there's a whole episode to be had on
Oh,
that.
absolutely.
Absolutely. Speaking of life, before we miss it, right now, at 3.5 billion years ago, is where we see the earliest generally accepted fossils.
Mm-hmm.
So we are now still in the Archean, we see stromatolites. So
Yay.
stromatolites, again, they're not direct fossils, but they are these stacked layers of minerals in such a
Are
composition.
these the ones that hang from the ceiling or stand from the ground?
No, they're not those. Ah, you jerk. Stromatolites. Basically, what these are formed by microbial mats.
Mm-hmm.
So these are, you know, single-celled organisms together in a goop in this sort of
Technical term.
mossy patch that, as they're metabolizing, they're releasing mineral excretions below them and building up these layers that form these layered mounds.
It's the concept kind of how a coral reef works, but not the purposeful colonial
Yes,
formation of a structure. It's just as they excrete those excess chemicals, they're forming these mounds.
indeed. So we see these at around this time. These are going to be pretty common. Stromatolites are not around as much today
Mm-hmm.
because conditions have changed. But at that time, these also would have been so that the kind of life that we have now, and now we have it in our time scale. We now officially have life. It cropped up somewhere along this
Yep.
line.
Where did you come from?
Where did it come from? Where did you come from, Mr. DNA? From your blood. These are single-celled, simple cells. So the no nucleus, right? These are prokaryotic cells like bacteria,
Mm-hmm.
like a lot of those extremophiles that we have today. They are photosynthesizing, which makes a whole lot of sense because there's one really fantastic source of energy on this planet that
And
you can always rely on.
and not much else life other than you.
Yes, exactly. Now, it's interesting that, you know, probably not long after certain microbes developed photosynthesis, other microbes probably developed the habit of feeding on those photosynthesizing microbes.
It's sort of like whenever a new avenue in society opens up, they're like, hey, we just designed this whole new, business concept online. Give it a month, someone has already figured out how to scam or exploit it.
Yep.
It's the same.
Well, and now you've got, life has begun, so your arms race has started. And now
Mm-hmm.
you've got natural, which means evolution has kicked off, which means natural selection is in effect,
Mm-hmm.
which means you've got some pathway is going, what's more efficient than making my own energy is stealing it
Yep.
from somebody else
There are
and
already
eating
these
them.
large stockpiles in the form of my neighbor.
Yes, exactly. A Fred over there has got weeks worth of energy in him.
It's fantastic. And the photosynthesizing's important because that becomes the basis of just about, as we discussed earlier, not all, but just about all, or most ecosystems. Photosynthesis is the base of
Yep.
that food chain. So this is where we first see that foundation formed.
Indeed. We also are going to start seeing, because, what photosynthesis does is one of the things it does is it takes in carbon dioxide and releases oxygen.
Which is good for us and most other oxygen breathing things.
Indeed. So this is we're seeing the beginning of that terraforming we were talking about,
Mm-hmm.
where now you have a feature on the planet that is releasing oxygen into the atmosphere. And it's not going to take off just yet, right? Right now we still have this very ancient, almost oxygen, completely no oxygen, almost
Yeah.
toxic atmosphere that is good for these microbes and nothing else, at least not yet.
I've heard just to drive home how different and weird this early Earth would have been, and I don't remember what color it was, but that the sky would not have been the blue that we
Oh, interesting.
recognize it because
Makes
of the
sense.
the molecular makeup of it. Without oxygen, it would not have been dispersing the light the same way, and so
Interesting. That's a very good point.
it would have looked different. Like even if you just were able to go back in a spacesuit and take a picture, it would not look like Earth.
That's cool. The other thing, actually, if you looked up at the sky, that would be different, as we mentioned in episode 12, is the moon would be bigger
Yeah, by
because
a
it was
bit.
closer.
Mm-hmm.
So as time has gone on, the gravitational interaction between the moon and the Earth means that the moon is basically pulling on the Earth,
Mm-hmm.
which slows the Earth's rotation and speeds up the moon's orbit. So the moon is slowly getting faster and slowly moving away.
So which is interesting to think about because a lot of, like I said, Mars went through a process where it was atmosphered as far as we can tell and then lost it. We are still changing. Like we're being slowed down.
Yeah?
Eventually, following that to its conclusion means someday the Earth will stop spinning. Like,
Yeah?
and so things are
Well,
not. I mean, or we'll lose
it's
our moon first.
I think we lose the moon
Yeah,
first.
it might not take
Is how
enough.
that.
That's very true.
Now, what does happen is that eventually, and this is what people always love to point this out because it's a fun little fact
Mm-hmm.
about the movement of the moon. Given enough time, and it's like 500 million years or
Yeah.
something, um, we will no longer be able to have a total solar eclipse
Yeah.
because the moon will be far enough away that it won't be able to block the sun.
Yeah. Well, and once we lose the moon, that's no more tides.
That's true.
We will
That
have
our
very
tides will
different.
change.
Mm-hmm. And so
Indeed.
Earth's still adjusting. It's just on a scale that we don't notice.
In the Archean, like we said, life now, and we should point out now, about almost 25 minutes into our timescale, we have hit the 3 billion year mark. We are now 3 billion years ago, which
Checkpoint
is
reached.
checkpoint reached, save point. We can save here. The Archean, right. So life has shown up, and I think that we kind of breezed over it, which is probably how it happened. Like I don't think that
Mm-hmm.
there wouldn't have been this big, life is on the planet, but it's at this point it really, as far as we can tell, it's not this transformative
Mm-hmm.
feature yet.
Well, and it's a thing I see a lot of things talk about is the fact that for the long period of time, life was just single-celled organisms. And a big part of that is that sex didn't exist yet,
Oh yeah, these were just splitting.
which slows down natural selection a lot. When you don't have, when
Yep,
the only diversity you're getting is via mutation, then you develop slowly. And so
indeed.
right now things were pretty stagnant. Things were not changing on the course of new species. Or I mean, new species were probably popping up all the time, but we weren't getting these crazy new designs.
Right. Now, that having been said, of course, we know next to nothing about this time period.
Exactly.
Right. We're talking about life a lot, but again, the fossil record at this point, the rock record in general, is extremely sparse. It's better than the Hadean was
Mm-hmm.
when there was just about nothing, but very little is known, and this is a time it may be that there was a lot of evolutionary innovation going on. Bacteria swap genes all the
Oh
time,
yeah,
which
no.
is a ridiculous habit of theirs.
Bacteria are very alien in the way they function, which is cool, but
Yeah.
crazy.
But this is also, it may very well be that the world was run by single-celled organisms for so long because there was no impetus
Mm-hmm.
to change, right? It maybe a change was needed
Yeah. So going
to
back to
see
our
that.
our island, ecosystem episode.
Episode 4.
Yeah, in that when you have a stable habitat, there's no reason to adapt past once you've adapted to that ecosystem. Like if the ecosystem's not changing, then once you're good enough to survive there, you don't need to keep getting better if there's no competition.
Yeah.
Like why put in the energy and effort? You will just kind of stabilize. And so the same thing could have been happening.
It's also interesting to think about. And now we should point out we're just kind of rambling right now as we
Yeah.
go in between the points. So these are thoughts off the top of the old noggin.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also an interesting point that there was also a lot of space.
Yeah.
So I wonder how severe competition was
Mm-hmm.
in a planet where you had single-celled organisms and they could probably go just about anywhere.
Yeah. Exactly. Like you may not have had this organisms being on top of each other and having to wrestle for they could have been just so spread out that
Yeah.
they weren't competing the same way. It's interesting to think about to where if you were able to go back and see this time, of course what it would look like in general is a very interesting question, but you could have seen this seemingly barren wasteland and barren seas that are just covered with living, a living mat of
Oh yeah.
organisms, which is like I said, very alien. Like sounds like something you would come across in a sci-fi.
It's true. And we don't have that today. And that's a really good interesting point
Mm-hmm.
is that bacteria and similar prokaryotic organisms behave differently in a world without plants and animals and anything else.
Yeah.
One of the reasons we don't have stromatolites around nearly as much today is because the sort of mats that are required to form them get eaten.
Yeah.
Because you've got all sorts of creepy crawlies these days that scoop up that algae and scoop up whatever it is and eat them. And
Mm-hmm.
so you don't, they can't stick around, right? That's now there's competition. Now there's something keeping them from holding that niche
Yeah.
that they would otherwise have.
All these new species coming in and taking the good niches in the ecosystem.
Indeed. So now we should point out also that still in the Archean,
Mm-hmm.
but we're in a time where we have a lot of the geological functions that we're going to see throughout the rest of history have started, right? So, like I said, we have oceans, which means
Mm-hmm.
we will now have ocean currents.
Yep.
We have an atmosphere, which means we will have we have weather,
Yeah.
of course, in much the same way that life has been around for a long time, pretty much all the Earth processes that are happening today have been happening.
Yeah, now it's functioning. It's just got a lot less, far fewer residents.
Indeed. And it looks very different.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Just as life has not become quite as recognizable as we have today, neither has the atmosphere, neither has the land. This is an alien planet.
Yes.
And indeed, speaking of plate tectonics, right around now, around 2.7 billion years ago, evidence indicates that the Earth saw the formation of the Kennerland supercontinent.
Dun, dun,
Da-ba-da-ba. So, a lot of people are probably familiar with the idea of a supercontinent. It's this phenomenon that happens when all or most of the pieces of continental crust on the planet join together in one giant subaerial landmass.
Yeah.
The Kennerland supercontinent has formed. It will be around for quite some time. This is a long-lived one.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people are familiar with Pangea.
Yes, that's
right?
what you typically hear about.
And it comes as a surprise to a lot of people to learn that Pangea was not the first supercontinent. This is actually something that has happened many, many times where the continents have come together, broken apart, come back together. The Kennerland supercontinent that has formed right now, so we're toward the end of the Archean. Any life that's living on the planet now, if it's in the ocean, it's in one giant ocean. And if it's on land, it's part of this one giant landmass.
Yep.
This might not even be the first supercontinent. There is potential evidence for at least one earlier case where all the continental crust came together as well.
Which is, it's once again, we're going so far back that things like supercontinents, the number of which can now become unclear. You would assume that the amount of times every landmass on Earth, or just about, has been all together would be a fairly simple thing to, put a fixed number on. It's like, no, when you're dealing with billions of years, maybe there was another one. I don't know. It's really vague. It's hard to tell.
We're still in a time period where we don't have a ton of evidence, right?
Yeah.
We have enough evidence to say a lot of we know what the crust was doing at least a bit. We know what life was doing at least a bit. But this is still a very ancient time. Like we said before, the Earth has an active surface, which means things get wiped away very relatively quickly.
Yeah.
So the odds of something surviving become lower and lower the more time passes.
Exactly. And so it's, think of it as the longer after you get to a crime scene after the crime, the less solid your evidence is going to be, because now it may have been moved, it may have degraded. And same thing goes here. Is right now we're looking at a very blurry picture of the Earth as far as our evidence goes, and with every step we take closer to modern day, that picture becomes more and more clear.
And now, at 2.5 billion years, the Archean eon has ended, and we have moved into the third, 3 out of 4, the third of 4 major eons of Earth history, the Proterozoic. The Proterozoic, we're going to start to see some very interesting things happen in the Proterozoic. We're going to see more diversity in life as this time period goes on, and we're going to start to see more increase in oxygen. As that life diversity is increasing, the atmosphere is changing. The world is becoming slowly more recognizable.
And so it's neat. We're seeing step by step, the process of it gradually turning into what we'll be able to recognize. And that's really the truth throughout all of Earth's history is. It's not until recently that things look like what we recognize it as.
Yes. These ancient eons that we're passing through also have further subdivisions. If you study the Proterozoic,
Yes.
you break them down into the Neo-Proterozoic and others. We won't go too deep into those, partially because I don't know them really. But also, we're breezing by.
Yeah, there's a lot.
Just like we discussed in the geologic time episode, enough is happening here that you can identify distinct sections,
Yes.
right? The geology is changing, your, chemical compositions are changing. Speaking of which, right about now, something very significant is happening in our timescale. If you look out the window, to your left, you will see the Great Oxygen Crisis.
Everyone hold your breath.
Everybody, well, everybody who's already alive.
Yes.
Hold your breath, tiny microbes. The Great Oxygen Crisis is a time where we see a major rise in oxygen. This is a relatively quick rise in oxygen, getting closer to what we see today.
Mm-hmm.
Right now we have an atmosphere where a significant portion of it is made up of oxygen, and this oxygen is coming from living things.
Yes.
Why does it happen right now? If living things have been photosynthesizing for so long, not entirely clear. It's possible that there was a geologic shift that happened. Something may have set it off. One of the big signs of rising oxygen comes in a mineral deposit known as banded iron formations, which are evidence of rising oxygen levels in the ocean, basically rust. And the minerals deposited at the bottom of the ocean are rusting with these rising oxygen levels.
Yeah, it's the same reason Mars is the color that it is from.
Indeed.
Which is another one of those examples, which is cool. That's a cool way to find your evidence, is that it's rusting the planet.
Yes, it is. Around this time, we also see the start of what's called the Huronian glaciation. So this is essentially an ice age that is so cold and extensive that it may have reached almost over the entire planet. This is a type of event that is often referred to as a snowball Earth.
Yes.
Where you had glaciers down to the subtropics, maybe even the tropics.
We mentioned that in our Cambrian episode a little bit, and the whole concept being that the white of snow and ice reflects more sunlight, which cools the Earth, which allows more freezing, which reflects more sunlight. And so that if you started getting cold enough that you got substantial glaciation, that could trigger a domino effect to spread the glaciers even farther.
Yep, and it's going to run away. So right now we're in this extreme glaciation, which is going to last some time longer. We're also seeing a rise in oxygen in the atmosphere. We're still in the Kennerland supercontinent. One of the other things that's very notable is this, I called this the Great Oxygen Crisis.
Yes.
And that's because this shift, right, this rise in oxygen, which sounds so good to us air breathers, would have been devastating to the life on Earth at the time.
Yeah, it's anytime you make a massive shift in the environment, it's going to kill off something.
So this might be the first known global mass extinction. Now, we don't have the fossils to know if that's true or not, but it's very likely that all these organisms that have been dominating the planet since we started this timescale 40 minutes ago, right? Almost, lots of billions of years ago, right? Are now suffering as these, basically, well, to put it in an extraordinarily ironic sense,
yes,
they're changing the planet so much that they can't handle the changes, and they're suffering for it.
If only there were a lesson to take away.
I'm sure there's some poignant point to be made there.
Yeah, we're not microbes. That can't.
Those stupid bacteria, I didn't even know what they were doing.
You're so dumb. You farting out the stuff that killed you.
Yeah, no wonder you're extinct. So yeah, so this may have been a dramatic shift. We
Yeah.
may, fellow time travelers, have just passed by a global mass extinction.
Which is it's neat to think. It's sort of like when they discovered the aquatic mass extinction. It's cool to look for evidence of those things because you'd think it'd be very obvious, but it isn't always. Sometimes it's like
Yeah,
I'd be surprised if there wasn't one here.
but we just don't know.
Mm-hmm.
And now we are at 2.1 billion years ago. A couple things are happening. The Huronian glaciation is subsiding. Our massive ice age that has gone on for a good 300 million years is ending, right? We're pulling out of this glaciation. Also, that supercontinent we've been on for even longer than that
Mm-hmm.
is breaking up. Kennerland, the pieces, tectonic activity is now starting to pull this continent apart into separate landmasses around the globe.
It's interesting because the supercontinents breaking up is that's one of those things that we discovered by looking at fossils today, and here we would have to be looking at you know rocks for the most part, and it's no,
Yeah.
it's still cool to me that these massive events we have to look for very small clues because it's so far back you're not going to get a big blaring sign. You have to really be able to read the details.
Yeah. And the way that we oftentimes we're reading continental movement in the past is with the magnetic signatures in the minerals.
Mm-hmm.
That as their position relative to the North Magnetic Pole has changed, we can read the signs of their motion across the surface of the Earth. And then you get continental, geologic formations that have
Yeah.
come together and broken apart. More on those in a bit. Right around now, something extraordinary is happening. Around now, right? So we are now at 2 billion years in the past. We are about 42 minutes into our timeline, about halfway through. Around this time, we see the earliest eukaryotic organisms.
That's us.
That's us, except they don't look like us because they're still single-celled. Eukaryotes are complex cells, right? More complex cellular organs, organelles,
Yeah, you get
the
the
little bitty functional things
yeah.
inside of a cell, such as the nucleus,
Mm-hmm.
exists in eukaryotes, mitochondria, chloroplasts, all those things you learn about in bioclass, the endoplasmic reticulum and things like
Yeah,
that.
exactly. The parts that we see in ours and all other animal cells.
Yep.
This is when we first start seeing evidence that they're around.
Yes, complex cells today are in animals, plants, fungi, and protozoans.
Mm-hmm.
At this time, once again, we're still single-celled. These are still very, microscopic, very simple organisms. They are now just very simple organisms with complex cells.
Yes.
There's also possible evidence around this time of multicellular organisms.
Yeah.
That some of these cells may now be coming together to form permanent colonies, right? It's not just that there's a bunch of them hanging out in the same place, that they're actually sticking together and functioning as a unit of several cells instead of just each cell for itself.
Yeah, we're starting to see the colonial aspect of microorganisms, which is very cool.
Right. And even a step beyond that, that they're, like a sponge,
Mm.
which is a body that's made up of maybe 4 different kinds of cells.
Yep.
We're not quite there yet. We'll see that in just a little bit, where we start to see something a bit more complex. But colonial, complex cells. Very exciting. Big step on the road to ourselves.
All the other cool things that we look for in the fossil record.
And all the best stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
We should also mention since we're talking about the origin of eukaryotes, the way that it is suspected, based on all sorts of great evidence, that eukaryotes arose is by a symbiotic relationship between a large prokaryote and a small prokaryote
Yes.
inside of them.
I was going to mention that. Is the mitochondria, we believe, used to be separate.
Yes, and they have their own DNA. They
Mm-hmm.
inherit genetic material separately. Same thing with chloroplasts. These are minor remnants of this symbiote that our cells took within us earlier on. Right around now, the continents are getting back together again. They're getting the band back together.
Ooh, I missed you guys so much.
Yeah, the reunion tour. The second of our big supercontinents that we're going to talk about is called Columbia, coming together around this time. Now, once again, if you look out the window, hands and arms inside, but look out the window.
Get your cameras ready, folks.
Yes, as time flies by us at 31.5 trillion times normal speed. So now we're in this range of... We are starting to see earliest evidence, possible evidence, of not just multicellular organisms, but differentiated multicellular organisms. Which is to say, not just a united colony of all of the same cell, but a body, for lack of a better word, of multiple types of cells working together.
Yeah, and doing different jobs, serving different functions, but all working as a single unit.
Yes, this is a hallmark of complex organisms.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Our bodies are made up of many, many different kinds of cells working together. I mentioned sponges before. We don't have sponges yet outside our time traveler device, but we do. A sponge is like 4 or 5 types of cells making a body.
And there's plenty of other well-known organisms that fall into this category. The Portuguese man-of-war, which people are pretty familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
Often
big jellyfish-looking thing.
Yeah, it often gets lumped in with jellyfish, but it is the blue. It has a big air sac on top to keep it afloat that acts like a sail to move it around. But it's a colonial organism. If it gets broken up, it will turn into multiple Portuguese man-of-wars. They will recoalesce.
Yeah, they come back together. And sponges, one of the greatest facts about sponges is that if you put a sponge through a blender, the cells will come back together and form a sponge again.
Yeah, exactly. Like they are not tissue yet, and that's what we're missing. Is they're working together, but they have not formed into a dependence on each other.
They're not. I had a word. I lost it.
Yeah, reliant.
Reliant on each other.
Yeah.
Exactly. They're not inseparable.
Mm-hmm. If you take one of our muscle cells away, it will die without the rest. Without the rest of our body system. Not so if we were a big old colonial organism.
Another thing that's cropping up around this time, we see just another extremely exciting thing, the earliest fossils of true plants.
Kind of important.
In this case, the earliest fossils of plants are right now considered to be red algae.
Mm-hmm.
Again, microscopic, single-celled.
Very simplistic.
But actual plants, right? These are photosynthesizing eukaryotic organisms, chloroplasts on the inside. The beginning of what will come to be a dominant group of organisms on the planet. We also see around this time the fossils that appear to be the earliest true fungi.
Which is
again,
very interesting.
Single-celled, very, very simple organisms, as organisms go. But fungi and plants have arrived on the scene of our timescale.
Which is pretty cool. It's interesting to find out when things popped up.
Yep.
You wouldn't think about fungus being that far back, but it's pretty neat.
Yeah, things are... Once again, we're seeing the slow development of the world as we know it.
Slowly but surely, the players will all be present and take the field.
It's interesting to think about how a complex organism is a series of simpler organisms coming together.
Mm-hmm.
That your eukaryotes are cells that formed by assimilating smaller cells,
Mm-hmm.
and that a complex organism is basically the logical next step of a colony.
Yes, exactly. It's just where, why don't we do this all the time? It's kind of the...
Yeah, why don't we just stay together? Hey, what if when we reproduced, we just kept doing this? Like the next generation stuck together like this.
Yep.
Speaking of things sticking together and coming apart, everybody look out the window of our time-traveling timescale podcast timescale and wave goodbye to the Columbia supercontinent.
No.
The continents once again are breaking apart. Tectonics is tearing them away from each other and pulling them out of the supercontinent that we had into separate segments.
Yeah, it's pretty logical once you think about it. If the continents are gonna move, eventually they're gonna bump into each other. Like,
oh yeah,
you can't put a whole bunch of moving pieces on a limited board and not expect them to collide. So it's not surprising that they, at times, and this a good thing for everyone to know. This does not mean that like Africa is running around at this time, bumping into everything. These land masses were very different. We mentioned that in the Antarctica episode that for a while Antarctica and Australia just were hanging out with each other, separate from everyone else for a little while.
Right, as one continent.
Mm-hmm.
You would not recognize these continents
Yes.
that we're seeing in our time scale right now.
So it doesn't mean that they broke up into 7 pieces. They could have broken up into any number of 2 big ones, 3 medium ones, or 10 really tiny. I mean, there's really no way to know.
Mm-hmm. And indeed, a lot of the time when continents, supercontinents don't all come together and come apart in one movement.
Yeah. 1, 2, 3,
right.
Split!
Usually it's bits and pieces come together.
Mm-hmm.
Until eventually everything has joined, and then when it breaks apart, it'll break apart, maybe one piece over here, maybe the whole thing breaks in 2, and then those 2 start breaking apart. It's not, it's a gradual, slow process.
We'll still mark the beginning of that breakup as when the first landmass began to leave the continent.
Yes.
But it could take they can take a long time to actually finish breaking up.
Absolutely. And some of them may, pieces that came together may never break up.
Yeah.
And just now they're together.
I used to always wonder as a kid why Europe was considered a continent when it's attached to Asia. Like, I was like, no, you're not.
Wasn't always attached.
And then
North and South America weren't always attached.
Yeah, which is, once I learned that it was on its own tectonic plate, that's why I was like, oh, that makes more sense. But it used to be so confusing because as a kid, a continent is a big piece of land surrounded by water. That's
right.
That's it.
Why are you guys breaking the rules?
Yeah, it's like, no, you stop trying to make yourself sound bigger than you are, Europe.
Now, plate tectonics is a subject we can certainly, we can go into detail on in a future episode if the listeners want it. But when a continent, the crust moves like a bunch of weirdly shaped conveyor belts, and the continents are lumpy chunks of the belt that are carried all over the place. When a continent splits, it's, you get this stretching of the crust from both sides. Tectonic activity is pulling on it until a weak line across the landmass breaks. And then the continent pulls apart, the crust between it thins until it's thin enough that water comes in.
Yeah.
Now you have, ocean, you have a small sea, which will eventually become an ocean. These also end up being rift zones where new crust is being formed, like the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. And so you're forming oceanic crust, which is low enough and thin enough that it is covered by oceanic water. This is happening today, right? East Africa is rifting today.
Yes, yes.
gradually separating apart. And we'll see this a few times. But then, like Will said, those forces that pull them apart, well, the Earth is a sphere.
Yeah.
So you can't go too far
If you continue to
before,
go in one direction, you eventually end up back where you were.
and indeed, the continents are back together again in our time scale. This time, the Rodinia supercontinent. They just can't stay away from each other.
It's the supercontinent formerly known as at this point. You just keep changing your name. It's the same old supercontinent.
You kind of just it's Rodinia Classic. Right about now, if you look outside with your super microscope cameras,
Yes.
we see an exciting fossil, and I'm actually going to name this fossil for you, dear listeners. We see a fossil called Bangiomorpha, which is a type of red algae, which has been around for a while now, as we discussed. But this one is the earliest example of two exciting things. First, it's the earliest definite example of a differentiated multicellular organism. Right? Like we were discussing before, this is an organism that now it is colonial, it has multiple cells doing different things.
Mm-hmm.
It is also the earliest known organism in the fossil record that reproduced sexually. What this means is that it's not just splitting its DNA and, splitting its cells in two.
Yeah.
It is exchanging DNA with other individuals, combining that DNA to make a new organism, right? This is how all animals reproduce. This is how plants and fungi are able to reproduce this way. This is a big innovation in reproduction because this allows you to have much more diversity in your next generation, in your genetic shifts.
Yeah, and the reason this is so important is, natural selection acts by putting the pressures on organisms, and the organism have to be different from each other for there to be any selection involved. Otherwise, it's all just
right.
Random. Rock fell on you, but we're all exact clones of each other, so it was just as likely that anything would happen. And when you're budding or splitting by just making a copy of yourself, you're just cloning, and the only way for there to be any difference or evolutionary change is through mutation. Just purely random things affecting your genetics. But now, when you reproduce, you're taking half of your DNA and mixing it with another organism's half of their DNA, but you don't know which halves. That's why you and your sibling are not exact copies, because you got a different 50% of your mom's DNA than your sibling and a different 50% of your dad's DNA. Now, they may be more or less similar. Me and my brother, he has brown hair, I have red hair, so ours are fairly separate. But then you can have some siblings that look almost exactly the same but aren't twins. This amount of difference gives a whole new way to put pressures and develop new adaptations, so it can really speed things up.
There's a lot more genetic variation for natural selection to act upon,
which is very exciting.
Yes, it is. So we're still in the Proterozoic eon. We're on the Rhodinian supercontinent. Oxygen levels are higher now, nicely higher, and perhaps that's even one of the reasons behind why we're seeing these complex organisms arise.
Now it sounds like a weather report.
Yes, it does. We take a quick break from the weather to point out that we are now at the 1 billion years ago mark, and almost an hour into our timescale. And that around this time, and we don't know for certain, this is mostly from genetic studies, molecular clock studies, like we talked about in episode 10, this is the time where it is thought that the first animals arose. Now again, these would have been extremely small, relatively very simple multicellular organisms, but the first direct ancestors of animals, if they did indeed show up around here, then now we are on a planet where we not only have bacteria and other prokaryotes, we have fungi, we have plants, we have animals, the stage is set. We have the
Yes.
earliest examples of all the major groups, all the major kingdoms
Mm-hmm.
of life that we have today.
And just to re-mention it, it took us an hour to get here.
Yes, it did. And things are gonna start picking up here in just a little bit.
Yeah. Now things can start speeding up. And this is part of why we did this this episode to begin with, but it really want to drive home the fact that the vast majority, 3 billion years of Earth's history was sans animals. It was without
Oh yeah.
animals. We focus on everything after that point when you're typically looking at the fossil record, but for Earth, this is a recent development.
Yes, this is a new thing.
Like right now, Earth's probably just now starting to really get bugged by the other planets to get it checked out.
I've seen a comic that was it was a webcomic of the moon and the Earth talking to each other, and the moon was like, "Hey Earth, you're not looking so good. What's wrong?" And the Earth is like, "Man, I got humans." And the moon's like, "Oh, man, I can't. Oh, that's a real shame. I'm really sorry." And then in one of the panels, you see the little shuttle fly off the Earth and land on the moon. And the moon goes, "Ah, I have them too."
I think I've seen that. I can't remember if it was that or a different one, but there's one where they go, they're contagious. Run, Mars! And then it just shows Mars going,
I have seen that.
Yep.
So back on Earth, we are now at a very exciting time, right? So we have we have a diversity of complex, though still very small, right? Microscopic, complex cells in the beginnings of complex organisms. We have an atmosphere that is much more developed, obviously, than when we started way back in the beginning. It's even got a bunch of oxygen. And I hinted at this a little while ago, but it's suspected by some that rising oxygen was what has allowed organisms to become larger and to become more complex. That source of fuel is something that was necessary to power the bodies of organisms.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it's we're not quite there yet, but when we were talking about the Cambrian explosion, that whole idea that it's not so much that life was got different as it may have been, the stage was set just right for a new change to happen.
Yes.
Enough things were in place for suddenly life to go, okay, how about animals?
Yeah.
Which
So
is
the rise in oxygen was rough for the old guard, but ushering in a new guard. Hey, listeners, right about now, Rodinia is breaking up.
sad.
The supercontinent of Rodinia is pulling apart into multiple continents once again. Will they be back again? Time will tell.
And then we'll tell you.
And then we will, and then this podcast will tell, and we'll all know. So another interesting thing's about to happen. Earlier, we mentioned when we were in the Huronian glaciation, that major, almost across the entire planet glaciation that was called Snowball Earth. Well, we are now in the start of a time period called the Cryogenian, which is another intense glacial period, and another incidence that is referred to as a Snowball Earth. In fact, over the next 100 million years or so, or minute and a half, we will see perhaps multiple pulses of Snowball Earth glaciation.
Yeah, it's this time when it was likely, it seems that the Earth may have been freezing and unfreezing and freezing and unfreezing, which is...
Yes, in ice ages, phenomenally unimaginable.
Yeah, and really that's the right term, is unimaginable. It's really hard to wrap your mind around to think of Earth as if it were Hoth.
Yes, exactly. And there aren't even any there's nothing you can cut open.
I know, right?
And hide inside for warmth.
Your tauntaun can't survive out there because it doesn't exist yet. It's I love learning about these early times when Earth was so alien. It's really eye-opening.
Sure is. Speaking of early times, right now, the latest Snowball Earth pulse ends and we enter the Ediacaran period. The Ediacaran fauna are the first large multicellular true animals. We mentioned these briefly in our Cambrian explosion episode. We now have large-bodied, macroscopic, which is so you can see them with the naked eye, animal life. Very, very exciting. We also have about 10 minutes left
Yes.
in our time scale.
This is how recently these incredibly weird, like these organisms are so strange we don't know who they're related to. We don't know whether they gave rise to modern groups or went completely extinct. We don't know how they moved around. It is these incredibly alien early life forms happened on this timescale 10 minutes ago.
Yes, exactly. The Ediacara, they're still around, right? These are long lasting. They showed up a little while ago. They're still governing the world. But we are about to see a major shift.
This is a big one.
The Proterozoic is drawing to a close. We are about to enter the final eon of our timescale. At about 540 million years ago, the Phanerozoic eon, which encompasses the entire rest of the history of the planet, is going to start in 3, 2, 1. Ladies and gentlemen, the Cambrian explosion. Kaboom! The rise of almost every form of animal life that we have today. We have arthropods and fish and all sorts of crazy stuff showing up now. This is the beginning of the Phanerozoic eon, the Paleozoic era, and of course the Cambrian period.
Yeah, this is when every recognizable grouping that we see today first popped up, all the major groups. And this is how recent it was in relative to everything else.
Yes. And things are going to start, the pace is going to pick up now.
Yeah, we're going to have to start speeding it up because now all the things we recognize are coming back to back.
Yes, things out the window of our time-traveling machine are happening a lot quicker.
Yeah, no, we are not speeding up.
Now, the Cambrian period is ending and enter the Ordovician period. Over this period, we're going to see a rise, a diversity of jawed fish, trilobites, brachiopods, mollusks, ancient reefs, some made of corals, others not. The rise of corals, in fact, in this time period as well.
The oceans are starting to take shape into a form that we can start to really recognize ecosystems that we see today.
Yes.
The predator-prey relationship is firmly taking hold. We start seeing some really cool predators.
Yup. We have animals with eyes and animals with teeth. And right now, the Ordovician ends in a mass extinction. One of the big 5 mass extinctions, the biggest that we know of. This is the start of the Silurian period, during which we are going to see evidence of plants and animals making it onto land for the first time.
It's taken it this long for us to finally start to walk on dry land.
Yup. And now the Silurian is over. We are in the Devonian period, the age of fishes, where we're going to see all sorts of fish, lots of sharks evolve around this time, huge diversity of sharks, armored fish, placoderms like Dunkleosteus.
Oh, he's so cool. This is one of the favorite things to say at the aquarium, and everyone loves this fact, but the thing that is, we've seen plants getting onto land now. Trees don't exist yet, so all of these animals we're talking about are older than trees.
Yes, all the land life at the moment is invertebrates, right?
Yes.
Insects, spider-type things.
Arthropod type stuff.
And very small plants, stuck by the edge of the water. But that's about to change. Right about now, we see vertebrates move onto land. Fish with legs crawl up onto land, and we have the rise of amphibians. Just in time for the Devonian to end in the second of the big 5 mass extinctions, which ushers us into the Carboniferous period, where we're going to see the rise of trees.
Yeah.
Massive forests, massive swamps. This is where most of our coal deposits come from. This is also going to see a big jump in oxygen levels once again. We also at this time see the first true reptiles start to appear. And right about now, oh, I missed it. A little while ago, Pangaea formed. The continents have come together again, and it is Pangaea. And indeed, the collision of North America and Africa during the formation of Pangaea is what created the modern-day Appalachian Mountains here in the eastern United States. Oh man, things are happening fast.
You turn your back for a second, and you just got Pangaea. It's crazy.
Just had Pangaea.
Boom.
Absolutely. And the Carboniferous is ending now, which ushers us into the Permian period, where we're going to see a diversity of early reptiles, early synapses, which are the ancestors and cousins of mammals.
Mm-hmm.
Things like Dimetrodon and such show up here.
Yeah, some really cool, weird stuff starts popping up there that get lumped in with dinosaurs, but are very much not.
Indeed. All this happening on the massive continent of Pangaea, supercontinent. Everybody take a breath, because the Paleozoic era, the first era of the latest eon, is about to end. The next era is the Mesozoic, the age of reptiles. And it's going to start with a bang 250 million years ago in 3, 2, 1, Permian extinction. The biggest extinction in the history of the planet, brings us into the Mesozoic era, starting with the Triassic period, where we're going to see the earliest turtles, mammals, dinosaurs, pterosaurs, those big marine reptiles, the earliest crocodiliforms, the earliest lizards. We're seeing modern groups.
All the good stuff.
All the good stuff. The age of reptiles has begun.
Yeah, so it's going to start speeding up now. Now, once again, we are not speeding up. It's just getting a lot more crowded.
No. Our list of things to mention is happening a lot quicker.
Yeah.
We are a little bit more than 200 million years ago now. And right now, the Triassic ends in another of the big 5 mass extinctions. This is the mass extinction that allows the Jurassic starts, and dinosaurs begin to rise. So that now we are in the age of dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to see favorites like Brachiosaurus, Stegosaurus, Allosaurus.
Yeah, a bunch of big cool ones.
And right about now, the rift is opening up between the eastern and western continents, forming the Atlantic Ocean as Pangaea is coming apart, and the continents are splitting out once again. Right around now, as that's happening, we're going to see some of the earliest examples of birds in the fossil record, as well as some of the earliest snakes in the fossil record, as the Jurassic draws to a close. And the Jurassic ends now and the Cretaceous period begins.
Things are happening much more back to back, because we're having a much more refined view of our fossil record at this point.
Yeah, and things are legitimately developing quickly now.
Yeah, we're getting diverse life.
Right about now, we see this spread of flowering plants.
Things can
Flowers
be pretty now.
Showed up. Since we're in the Cretaceous, now we're also seeing the development of groups of dinosaurs like the ceratopsians, the hadrosaurs, early tyrannosaurs.
Yeah.
And at this point, time's going by so fast, not even that early anymore.
Yeah, exactly. Like, we're starting to see some of the really notable things. It's still crazy to me to think that for most of life on the land, there weren't flowers.
Yes.
Such a thing we're used to today.
If you look out your window right now, you might even see some of the earliest true crocodilians.
Now the world is worth living in.
Now it's a perfect world. We have snakes and crocs living together. All right, things are going to pick up really quick. You ready? We have a minute left. The Rocky Mountains started forming right now, just in time for the KPG mass extinction, which happens now. This is the end of the age of dinosaurs, the end of the Mesozoic era, and the start of the Cenozoic, the age of mammals, which means we are in the Paleogene period, and mammals are starting to take off. Right about now, the Indian subcontinent has collided with Asia to form the Himalayas. In the Paleogene period, we're also now seeing the cropping up of most modern groups of mammals. Primates, bats, whales, most recognizable groups are showing up just outside in our timescale. And now we see the spread of grasslands. Get that. Grasslands. Grass is now taking over the planet. The Paleogene period ends now and ushers in the Neogene period as the world begins to get cooler. Right about now, Antarctica is frozen over. Antarctica is now completely covered in ice. The earliest hominins, the earliest human ancestors, are showing up now. The Ice Age begins now, and 3, 2, 1, we are in the present, and our time scale is over. Right about now on our time scale, David and Will sit down to make a podcast about the geologic time scale.
Yep.
What a crazy ride.
There you go. So that if that doesn't drive home how recent the things we're typically looking at are, I don't know what else, because that last minute is where all of mammals that we'd recognize, all of them start really showing up.
Oh, yeah. The age of mammals was the last minute of this podcast. And you'll notice Will didn't talk.
Yeah.
Because when we rehearsed it, there was just no time.
It's so much is happening in there. And it's you did the quick math at the beginning as to the number of events in the first hour.
Yep, is about the same as the number of events we had to list off in the last 15 minutes.
And so it's, it really is that the more recent something is, the more clearly we can see it.
Yes. And once the Cambrian explosion happened, since then we have seen a much greater rate of important new changes, right?
Yeah.
Important to us. Like we said, there was probably lots of diversification and shifting going on early on, but that was bacteria we have no fossils for.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and we talked about that Cambrian explosion is that part of the reason for seeing those fossils might just be that we finally have fossilizable things. We have fossils before that, but very rare ones. But since that point now, most of life has the ability to be fossilized much more readily, and we can now have this huge diversity. They're now sexually reproducing. They now have eyes to hunt each other with. They're now
teeth to grab each other with.
They're now dominating both the land and sea, very shortly after that. So we start seeing very quickly life kick things into the fast lane.
Indeed. So there you go. The history of the planet in an hour and 15 minutes. 1 million years to the second. Listeners, we hope you enjoyed this trip down memory lane.
Mm-hmm. Back through the ages.
Thank you very much for joining us. As always, we are the Common Descent Podcast, and we'll see you next time.
Take care, everyone.